Charlton Heston stood up so fast that his chair scraped backward across the Tonight Show stage floor, his massive frame rising to its full height as he pointed directly at Yul Brynner, the specific and unmistakable authority of his physical presence carrying an intensity that several people present later compared to watching one of his own most commanding screen performances suddenly erupt into genuine, unscripted reality. It was February 3rd, 1977, at 2:49 p.m., NBC Studios in Burbank, and the man who had played Moses himself, who had parted an entire ocean on screen and carried stone tablets down a mountain, was now standing over another actor with an intensity that made 23 million Americans lean forward in their living rooms. Yul Brynner did not flinch, his own considerable physical presence meeting Heston's intensity without a single visible trace of retreat or hesitation. He rose from his own chair to meet Heston's gaze directly, and for 11 seconds neither man said a single word. Coming up exactly what Yul Brynner said that made Charlton Heston abandon 2 decades of careful public restraint, the real story of what actually happened on the set of the 10 Commandments that neither man had ever discussed publicly, and what happened when Johnny Carson realized he might be about to witness an actual physical altercation between 2 of the biggest stars in the world. But before we dive in, I see messages all the time in the comment section that some of you didn't realize you weren't subscribed. So if you could do me a favor and double-check if you're a subscriber to this channel, that would be tremendously appreciated. It's simple, it's free, and it's something anybody who watches this show frequently can do to help us keep everything going. Please do double-check if you've subscribed, and thank you so much, because in a strange way, you're part of our history, and you're on this journey with us, and I appreciate you for that. Now let's get into what happened that night. Because what almost nobody watching that broadcast understood was that this confrontation had actually started 21 years earlier, on a desert set in Egypt, and had simply been waiting for the right moment to finally surface. Charlton Heston and Yul Brynner were cast opposite each other in Cecil B. DeMille's The 10 Commandments in 1956. Heston playing Moses and Brynner playing Ramesses, 2 of the most demanding and most physically committed leading men in Hollywood, placed into direct dramatic opposition for one of the most ambitious productions in the history of American cinema. Both men approached the role with a specific and total seriousness that reflected their broader professional character. Heston famous even at that early stage of his career for an almost monastic dedication to research and physical preparation, spending months studying Hebrew scripture and consulting with religious scholars to prepare for a role he considered among the most significant responsibilities of his career. Brynner bringing an equally total commitment, but expressed through a considerably more theatrical and commanding physical presence that had already made him a genuine sensation on Broadway in The King and I. What developed between them during the production, according to accounts eventually given by crew members present on that set, was a specific and increasingly competitive dynamic that went beyond ordinary professional rivalry into something considerably more personal. 2 enormously talented and enormously ambitious actors, each convinced, in his own private assessment, that his own approach to the material represented the more serious and more legitimate interpretation of the film's central conflict. The specific circumstances of both men's backgrounds deserve fuller understanding because they illuminate exactly why this particular competitive dynamic developed with such genuine intensity. Heston had grown up in rural Michigan in circumstances of considerable modesty, developing his craft initially through university theater and radio work before establishing himself in New York theater and television. A trajectory that instilled in him a specific and lasting belief that legitimate acting required rigorous academic preparation and genuine intellectual engagement with the material. Brynner's background was considerably more unconventional, a performer of Russian and Mongolian heritage who had worked as a circus acrobat and cabaret singer before finding his way to Broadway, a path that gave him an instinctive and physically expressive approach to performance that owed less to academic preparation and more to a specific and considerable natural charisma that had been refined through years of direct audience performance rather than formal theatrical training. These fundamentally different paths into the profession produced, in each man, a genuine and deeply held conviction about what legitimate acting actually required. convictions that were bound to collide once both men were placed into the same demanding production. The specific texture of this rivalry deserves fuller understanding because it explains exactly why the tension between them persisted for over 2 decades without either man ever fully addressing it publicly. Heston, according to multiple crew members present during the production, privately considered Brynner's performance style excessively theatrical, believing that Brynner's stage-trained bravado, however effective for a Broadway musical, represented a fundamentally less disciplined and less serious approach to screen acting than Heston's own carefully researched and physically embodied preparation. Brynner, for his part, according to accounts given by people close to him during this period, considered Heston's approach rigid and overly cerebral, believing that Heston's extensive research and careful physical preparation produced a performance that was technically accomplished but that lacked the specific and dangerous unpredictability that Brynner believed genuine screen charisma actually required. Both men expressed these private assessments only to close friends and colleagues, maintaining, in every public setting across the following 2 decades, the careful professional courtesy that Hollywood's competitive but interconnected community generally required of its biggest stars. The physical demands of the production itself deserve additional attention, because they compounded the psychological tension between both men in ways that made their eventual confrontation almost inevitable given enough time and the right circumstances. Filming took place across several months in the Egyptian desert under conditions that both men later described, separately, as among the most physically demanding of their entire careers. Extreme heat, difficult location logistics, and the specific pressure of appearing in a production that Cecil B. DeMille had explicitly positioned as one of the most ambitious and most expensive films in Hollywood history. This pressure, combined with the genuine physical exhaustion both men experienced across months of demanding location shooting, created a specific and volatile environment in which small professional disagreements carried a weight and an intensity that might have dissipated more easily under more comfortable production circumstances. This careful public courtesy nearly broke down completely during one specific incident on the Egyptian set that has never been fully documented publicly until now. According to an account eventually given by a script supervisor who witnessed the exchange directly, a disagreement erupted between Heston and Brynner during the filming of a particularly demanding confrontation scene between their 2 characters. A disagreement rooted in fundamentally different approaches to how the scene's central conflict should be performed. Heston, according to this account, believed the scene required a specific restraint that would allow the audience to feel the weight of the moral conflict between Moses and Ramesses without excessive theatrical demonstration. Brynner believed the scene demanded a more explosive and visually commanding performance that would properly convey Ramesses' absolute authority as Pharaoh. The disagreement escalated, according to the script supervisor, to the point where both men's voices rose considerably above the ordinary volume of professional disagreement. And for a tense moment, according to this account, it appeared that the confrontation might become physical before DeMille himself intervened, insisting that both actors trust his own directorial judgment about how the scene should ultimately be performed. Neither man ever discussed this specific incident publicly, and the professional courtesy that both men maintained for the remainder of the production and for the following 2 decades effectively buried what had actually happened on that set until circumstances finally brought it back to the surface. Both men, according to people who knew them separately across the following decades, carried private and somewhat different accounts of what that incident had actually meant. Heston, according to a close friend who discussed the production with him privately years later, considered the incident evidence of Brynner's fundamental unwillingness to consider that a different approach to the material might carry genuine artistic merit, an intellectual inflexibility that Heston found professionally frustrating even as he maintained careful public courtesy toward his co-star. Brynner, according to people close to him during this period, remembered the incident somewhat differently, describing Heston's insistence on his own approach as a specific kind of academic rigidity that failed to appreciate the genuine dramatic power that instinctive theatrical performance could bring to a scene, regardless of how carefully that performance had or had not been intellectually prepared in advance. These two accounts, never reconciled or even directly compared between the two men across the following 2 decades, meant that both actors carried genuinely different private narratives about the same shared incident. Narratives that neither had ever had the opportunity to test directly against the other's actual perspective until circumstances finally brought them face to face on a television stage in 1977. Quick reminder before we continue, because this next part of the story matters enormously. If you're enjoying this so far, take just a second to hit that like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect moment. Because what happens on that stage in a few minutes reveals something about one of Hollywood's most carefully concealed rivalries that almost nobody ever fully understood. By 1977, both Heston and Brynner had built extraordinarily successful careers, built substantially on the specific dignified authority that had made both of them internationally recognizable stars. Heston increasingly associated with a specific brand of serious, historically minded American cinema, Brynner having built an entire secondary career around his signature role in The King and I, a performance he had continued playing on stage for decades after the original Broadway production. Johnny Carson had booked both men for the same broadcast to discuss a joint retrospective interview about the golden age of the historical epic, an appearance built entirely around what Carson's producers anticipated would be warm, mutually respectful reminiscence about one of the most successful films either man had ever appeared in. Carson himself had a genuine professional respect for both men that extended across many years of separate interviews. Having found Heston consistently thoughtful and articulate about the craft of acting and the responsibilities of portraying significant historical and religious figures, and having found Brynner consistently magnetic and unpredictable in ways that made for reliably compelling television, regardless of the specific subject matter under discussion. Carson's production team considered this particular pairing something of a coup, two of the most recognizable faces in American cinema sharing a stage for what they anticipated would be a uniquely prestigious evening of reminiscence about one of the most successful religious epics in film history, entirely unaware of the specific and carefully concealed tension that had persisted between the two men since their shared production over 2 decades earlier. The broadcast began exactly as anticipated. Both men discussing the technical and historical ambitions of the Ten Commandments production with genuine and evident pride, Carson guiding the conversation through its expected territory of behind-the-scenes anecdotes and reflections on Cecil B. DeMille's considerable directorial ambitions, both actors demonstrating the polished, practiced ease of men who had discussed this same production countless times across the preceding 2 decades without ever once approaching the specific private tension that had actually persisted between them. For the first 15 minutes, according to everyone present, the conversation proceeded with exactly the warm, collegial tone the production had anticipated, both men appearing entirely comfortable in each other's company, offering the kind of polished, professional reminiscence that had characterized every one of their previous public appearances together across the preceding 2 decades. Roughly 17 minutes into the broadcast, Carson, attempting to generate an interesting comparative discussion between two performers whose approaches to their craft differed so distinctly, asked both men what they believed had ultimately made their specific dynamic on screen so effective. Do not miss what happens next, because it is the moment this entire story has been building toward. Yul Brynner answered first, and his answer, according to everyone present, began with the same polished professional courtesy that had characterized the broadcast's opening minutes, a reflection on the specific creative tension between restraint and theatricality that had defined their on-screen conflict. But as he continued speaking, his tone shifted, carrying an edge that several people present recognized as departing from his usual careful public diplomacy. And he said, directly and without the customary softening that decades of professional courtesy typically required, that he had always privately believed his own performance carried the film, that Heston's more restrained approach, while technically accomplished, had required Brynner's own theatrical intensity to give the film's central conflict any genuine dramatic weight at all. He said this with a specific and unmistakable confidence that revealed, for the first time in any public setting, exactly what he had apparently believed privately for over 2 decades. The studio audience, sensing the specific and unexpected edge in Brynner's tone, went quiet, several people shifting uncomfortably in their seats, uncertain whether they were witnessing genuine professional disagreement or simply a more candid version of the ordinary creative discussion the segment had been designed to produce. Several audience members seated close enough to observe both men clearly described a specific shift in the physical atmosphere of the studio in this exact moment. A sudden increase in tension that several people compared, in interviews given afterward, to the specific feeling of watching two large predatory animals recognize each other's presence for the first time. An instinctive and almost physical wariness that preceded any actual confrontation, but that made clear to everyone present that something considerably more significant than ordinary television conversation was beginning to unfold in front of them. Charlton Heston's expression, according to everyone present, shifted immediately and unmistakably, the careful professional composure that had defined his public persona for over 2 decades, giving way to something considerably more direct. Heston did not respond immediately with words. He stood up, his chair scraping backward across the stage floor with a sound that cut through the studio's uncertain silence, and pointed directly at Brynner, his massive frame carrying an authority that made the studio audience go completely still. He said, his voice carrying none of the careful diplomatic restraint that had defined every previous public statement he had ever made about that production, that he had waited 21 years for Brynner to finally say something like that directly to his face rather than only to the friends and colleagues who had apparently been hearing this specific assessment privately for over 2 decades. Yul Brynner did not back down. He rose from his own chair to meet Heston's gaze directly, and for 11 seconds, according to the show's director who reviewed the tape afterward, neither man said a single word, simply standing and facing each other with an intensity that made every person in that studio, including Johnny Carson, genuinely uncertain what was about to happen next. The specific physical dimensions of this standoff deserve documentation because they explain exactly why the moment felt as genuinely dangerous as everyone present described it afterward. Both men were physically substantial and considerably imposing figures even by Hollywood standards. Heston standing well over 6 feet tall, with the specific muscular bearing that had made him convincing as figures of genuine physical authority across dozens of historical epics. Brynner considerably shorter, but carrying an equally formidable physical presence built through years of demanding stage work and his own considerable natural intensity. The visual contrast of these two men standing chest to chest, according to multiple accounts, carried a genuine physical menace that went beyond ordinary celebrity disagreement. Two men whose careers had been built substantially on convincing audiences of their capacity for genuine physical and moral authority, now appearing to test that authority directly against each other in real time. Carson began rising from behind his own desk, his expression carrying the specific alarm of a host who understood he might be about to witness an actual physical altercation between two of the most physically imposing stars in the world. Heston finally spoke again, and what he said revealed, for the first time in public, the full account of what had actually happened on that Egyptian set 21 years earlier. He described the specific disagreement during the confrontation scene, the escalating argument that DeMille had ultimately needed to personally resolve, and he said that he had carried a specific private resentment about that incident for over 2 decades, believing that Brynner had never fully respected the seriousness of his own approach to the role, a resentment that Brynner's comment moments earlier had apparently confirmed as entirely justified. Yul Brynner, according to everyone present, was quiet for a long moment after Heston finished speaking. Then something shifted in his expression, the confident edge that had characterized his earlier comment giving way to something considerably more reflective. He said that he remembered that afternoon on the Egyptian set with a specific clarity he had never expected to discuss publicly. And he admitted, for the first time in any public setting, that his own private assessment of Heston's performance had been shaped considerably more by his own competitive insecurity than by any genuine professional judgment about the quality of Heston's work. He said that he had spent much of his career believing that his specific theatrical background gave him a legitimate claim to superior screen presence, and that watching Heston's meticulously prepared and deeply researched performance on that set had produced in him a genuine private anxiety that his own more instinctive and less academically prepared approach might be considered, by serious critics and by DeMille himself, the less legitimate form of the craft. Brynner elaborated further, describing the specific circumstances of his own unconventional path into the profession. A childhood and young adulthood spent in circus and cabaret work that had given him extraordinary, natural stage presence, but that had never included the kind of formal theatrical education that Heston and many of his other most respected peers had received. He said that this specific gap in his formal training had produced, across his entire career, a persistent private insecurity that he compensated for through exactly the kind of confident, sometimes aggressive assertion of his own talent that had characterized his earlier comment on Carson's stage. A defensive pattern he said he had never fully examined until this exact public confrontation forced him to finally articulate it directly. He said that this anxiety, rather than any genuine assessment of Heston's abilities, had actually driven the confrontation on that Egyptian set, and had continued driving his private assessment of Heston's work for the following 2 decades. Charlton Heston, according to everyone present, was visibly moved by this admission, his own earlier intensity giving way to something considerably more contemplative. He said that he had never once considered that Brynner's confidence during that production might have concealed genuine professional insecurity, having always assumed, based on Brynner's confident public persona, that his rival's dismissiveness toward Heston's approach reflected genuine conviction rather than defensive competitiveness. Johnny Carson, watching this unfold from behind his own desk, made the deliberate decision, according to production staff present, not to redirect the segment back toward its planned structure, understanding that what was happening in front of him carried a weight considerably more significant than any retrospective interview the broadcast had originally been designed to produce. The studio audience, 300 people who had come expecting warm, nostalgic reminiscence, sat in a silence that several people present described as the most complete and most genuinely moved silence they experienced at a live television taping, watching 2 of the most physically imposing and most professionally accomplished actors in Hollywood history set aside 2 decades of carefully concealed rivalry and simply tell each other the truth. Several audience members later described a specific privilege in witnessing this exchange, understanding, even as it unfolded, that they were seeing something considerably rarer than ordinary celebrity interview content. 2 genuine legends of American cinema demonstrating, through real and unscripted vulnerability, that even the most accomplished and confident public figures carried private uncertainties they rarely allowed the world to see. What followed was a considerably longer and more genuinely candid conversation than either the audience or the production staff had anticipated. Heston and Brynner discussing, with a directness neither had ever displayed publicly before, the specific texture of what their competitive dynamic had actually cost both of them across 2 decades, alongside a mutual and newly articulated respect for the genuinely different but equally legitimate approaches each man had brought to their considerable craft. The broadcast ran significantly over its scheduled time, NBC making no attempt to cut away from what had become one of the most unexpectedly candid, unscripted moments in the program's history. NBC's switchboard, according to production staff who monitored it, received an unusually high volume of calls in the days following the broadcast. Viewers writing and calling specifically to describe how genuinely fascinating they had found watching 2 legendary actors finally discuss, with complete honesty, a professional rivalry that decades of careful public courtesy had always kept hidden from public view. Several of these callers specifically mentioned their own professional rivalries, describing a particular resonance in watching 2 men whose competitive tension had never fully erased an underlying mutual respect neither had ever previously acknowledged directly. One caller, a man who had spent over a decade in a competitive professional relationship with a colleague at his own workplace, told a production staff member that he found himself genuinely reconsidering the specific assumptions he had made about his colleague's motivations. prompted directly by watching Brynner's admission that his own confident public assertions had actually concealed genuine professional insecurity rather than reflecting simple confident conviction. This response, echoed across the substantial volume of calls and letters NBC received in the following weeks, suggested that what had happened on that stage had touched something considerably larger than the specific story of two accomplished actors. A broader recognition among viewers that competitive rivalries, however genuinely felt, often conceal considerably more vulnerability than their outward confidence typically reveals. Yul Brynner and Charlton Heston never developed a close personal friendship in the years that followed. Their fundamentally different temperaments never fully reconciling into anything resembling genuine intimacy. But colleagues who worked with both men in later years said that each spoke of the other, from that point forward, with a specific and genuine professional respect that had been considerably more qualified before that broadcast. In the years following that broadcast, according to people who worked with both men separately, something genuinely shifted in how each approached discussions of the other in professional settings. Heston began speaking of Brynner's performance in The Ten Commandments with a specific and newly articulated appreciation for the theatrical intensity Brynner had brought to the role, acknowledging, in later interviews, that this quality had genuinely elevated the film's central dramatic conflict in ways his own more restrained approach could not have achieved alone. Brynner, for his part, began speaking of Heston's meticulous preparation with a similarly newfound respect, describing it in one later interview as a discipline he had come to genuinely admire, even though it remained fundamentally different from his own more instinctive approach to performance. Yul Brynner was diagnosed with lung cancer in 1983 and died on October 10, 1985, 8 years after that broadcast. In the final years of his life, Brynner became known for recording a poignant public service announcement about the dangers of smoking, released posthumously, in which he spoke directly to camera warning viewers about the habit that had ultimately cost him his life, a message that reached millions of Americans in the months following his death. Charlton Heston, upon hearing of Brynner's death, gave a public statement that specifically referenced their Tonight Show confrontation, saying that the honesty of that exchange had taught him something about the specific insecurities that even the most confident and accomplished performers often carried privately, and that he had come to consider Brynner, despite their decades of competitive tension, one of the most genuinely talented actors he had ever shared a screen with. There is one final detail about this story that deserves to be understood, something that connects the entire arc of both men's careers back to what happened on that Tonight Show stage. Years after both men had passed away, when film historians and biographers began examining the full scope of the golden age of the historical epic for various retrospective projects, several specifically cited the Heston-Brynner Tonight Show confrontation as one of the most genuinely revealing pieces of evidence available about the actual working dynamics behind some of Hollywood's most beloved and most carefully polished classic productions. One film historian, in a documentary examining the making of The Ten Commandments, noted that the broadcast offered a rare and genuine glimpse behind the specific mythology that had grown up around DeMille's production over the following decades. Evidence that even the most seemingly harmonious and successful collaborations often concealed genuine competitive tension that participants, for entirely understandable professional reasons, rarely if ever discussed publicly during their own lifetimes. This historian specifically credited the broadcast with providing a considerably more complete and considerably more human understanding of exactly what it had actually cost both men, professionally and personally, to bring one of American cinema's most enduring epics to the screen. If this story moved you tonight, I want you to think about the professional or personal rivalries in your own life that pride and careful public courtesy may have prevented you from ever fully and honestly discussing, and about what might be revealed if both people involved finally found the courage to say what they actually believed directly to each other's faces. You do not need a television camera and 23 million witnesses to have that conversation. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that even the most confident rivals are often carrying more insecurity than their public composure ever reveals. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories about the moments when Hollywood's biggest stars finally said what they had spent decades only saying privately. And drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and telling me about a rivalry in your own life that honesty might finally be able to resolve.